Chachamaru was hiking in the forest when he got lost. After wandering for hours, he collapsed from exhaustion. Luckily, he was found by Taimi and taken back to her village. That night, the demon Yananov attacked the village and kidnapped Taimi. Now it's up to Chachamaru to get her back. After the excellently portrayed intro sequence, you are thrown straight in at the ground floor of Yananov's Tower of Abyss. Walking forward, you are presented with this massive gaping hole that, should you step near, you will plummet down. On your descent, you'll notice various platforms on the left that house doors. Try to fall towards one and you'll find yourself in a dungeon level. Each floor has a different layout, with pitfalls that can sometimes be jumped over using A. You actually get a 3-tile clearance with your jumps in a similar way that Link does in Link's Awakening. There will be chests that you can open for armor, keys and the like. Various doors block your way and might be opened by a key or sealed by a magic spell. You'll often see enemies meandering about in areas that you can't reach. In fact, it may seem on some levels you can't progress at all. Don't worry too much about it, open what you can and then retreat back to the main tower part. Note you can't ascend the tower again at first, but you can drop down further levels, which you will have to do. Eventually you'll come across enemies that you can fight. Come into contact with them to be taken to the battle arena. Here, you simply press A when next to an enemy to attack it, trying to kill all of them before your own HP runs out. There's little art to your combat save trying to pick enemies off one at a time and not get ganged up on. You earn XP and level up in much the way you'd expect. Keep exploring until you find doors that you can open. Reading signs doesn't help that much. The text is somewhat cryptic anyway, so don't be concerned in translating it. Basically, if you come up to an obstacle, press A next to it, and if it doesn't budge, you can't go that way yet. There are some pretty entertaining story sections in the game. At one point you'll come across a skull embedded in the wall. One of its eyes has rolled away, and it'll plead with you to go find it. A ring on the floor is Izumi's fountain. Drinking from it replenishes your health, so these are good places to hang around if you're wanting to go for the enemies to level up. Note, they don't respawn, so grinding isn't really an option, but you actually don't have to fight the enemies. The battle arena has only 3 sides and can be easily escaped at any time by simply walking out. You have to kill all the monsters in an encounter to get the experience, but it's good to bear in mind you're not stuck in a battle if it's going horribly. You will have to clear out the whole thing at once though. Killing 2 out of 3 zombies in a battle, then leaving, will cause them all to reappear with no actual benefit to you. It takes a very long time to level up. Each battle screen, usually featuring 3 of an enemy, grants you a measly 6 experience points, and you need 100 to reach the next level, meaning you basically have to clear out all available targets for ages before you'll notice any progress in that department. It doesn't really encourage you to even engage targets that you don't have to. Some will block your way, or guard chests that you need to open, but just as many can be avoided. The sound is quite grating at times, especially the wall bumping noise, and needed a lot more work throughout. Visually though, it's quite accomplished. Aside from the underwhelming combat sequences and the occasional soft locks, if you miss something on a higher floor that you need to escape a lower one, you're basically buggered. This is actually a very well executed puzzle RPG that is possible to enjoy without needing the text all that much. Pick your sides and engage in all-out war with your nation's enemies. Another turn-based strategy game here with lots of customization. Choose yours and your opponent's resource pool, whether or not they have radar, how well equipped they are at finding you, and so on. You can choose between several different maps, each with a blurb telling you a bit about the difficulty, terrain, and so on. The graphics are a veritable accomplishment. Before each level starts, you are greeted with a frankly stunning parallax-scrolling seascape, with the briefing text animated in this simple fade-in-out format that amazes me it had never been thought of before now. Such a basic but striking effect that perked my attention up from the reluctance I felt when faced with trying to play another Japanese-language wartime strategy game. Unfortunately, my newfound enthusiasm was dashed as soon as I stepped foot in the war room, whereby you're faced with one of the most complex set of actions and instructions of all time. Were this in English, it'd be complex enough. There are around 24 commands that you can give your fleet, some of which I can read, but none of which I particularly understand the actions of. I surmise that you are mainly moving your ships forward up the map until you come into range of enemies, which then presents new options to attack and so on. Fundamentally, Fleet Commander Versus is a vastly complex game of battleship, with every option you need in a fun strategy game, and about 1,000 options you don't. Still, it sounds great and looks phenomenal. If you're more fluent in Japanese and/or strategy games than me, give it a go. Otherwise, I'd find it hard to give fair comment. We haven't rescued a princess for seemingly weeks now. This time, the brothers Peke and Poko have to vanquish the big beardy Daruman and save Nana-chan from his salacious grip. The object in Daruman Busters is to fire blocks into the puzzle field from either the left or right side. You can move Peke and Poko up and down the sides, firing blocks inward from the left using B and from the right using A. The blocks will hurtle inwards until they either hit another block or Daruman himself. Aiming at the monster does nothing. You need to eliminate blocks in groups of 2 or more, vertically or horizontally, but not diagonally, to the extent that he hits the floor. If a block is hit by a fired block, it'll be replaced by it, with the block that was hit being moved one space across. Gravity is in effect, meaning blocks will always fill downwards as much as they can. Also, the monster, or monsters on later levels, are flinging blocks into the mix periodically as well. There's not much else to it. Essentially, don't let the monsters reach your girl at the top of the level. As the stages go on, more variations of blocks get featured, meaning they're harder to match up. You can also get rockets that you can fire at the monster, which will knock it down a bit and stun it, stopping its meddling for a short while. Basically, don't let one of the rows fill up if at all possible, as it's trickier to fire matching pairs onto it. You want to always be able to fire something from the side. Also, it's not always advantageous to fire at the row of blocks the monster is standing on, as he can mess about with these, so the ones you aim at might not be there once you've fired the shots. Aim to get the beast down there by clearing out the stationary blocks from a few rows beneath him. A simple premise and a fast-paced game that reminds somewhat of Palamedes, but actually playable. Decent. Destroy the other tanks before they destroy you or your base. Sounds simple enough? It really couldn't be any simpler. No special weapons or any elaborate game design. Might strike you that BattleCity is a title to be ignored, but I promise you that's not the case. You're on your own inside BattleCity, against hordes of enemy tanks of varying strengths. The aim of each level is to seek and destroy the pre-designated number of opponents without having your base destroyed or losing all your lives. There are 35 levels in the game. There are always 20 enemies that spawn in periodically at the top of the screen for you to eliminate, although the strengths of these will increase as the levels go by. The basic enemy takes one shot, but the largest tanks take several. If your bullets hit each other, they'll cancel out, so this can be a good defense in a pinch. Any tiles that have brickwork on them can be destroyed, either by you or by an enemy, in a Space Invaders kind of way. The strategy is similar to that game actually, whereby you need to balance between defense and the line of sight you need to make the shots. There are other blocks that are sturdier. If you manage to upgrade your own tank enough, you can destroy them, but the opponents will never be able to, so leaving them as cover is probably to your advantage. There'll be what I assume to be foliage, which can be driven and shot through just fine, but the view is somewhat obscured, meaning caution is needed around these. Also, there are rivers that neither you nor your enemies can cross, but can be fired over. There are pickups that freeze time, allowing you free reign over the whole arena, blasting anything that you see. Enemies will even spawn in during this time frame and still be frozen. You can gain a massive advantage here. Other pickups have a star on them. This increases the power level of your tank by 1, meaning you'll be able to fire more shots simultaneously, you'll move a bit faster, and you'll take more hits to kill. Die, however, and you're back down to the base tank. There are other pickups you'll discover too, including one which puts an invulnerable barrier around your base for a short while, and grenades that destroy every adversary on screen. How you approach BattleCity depends on the level of your tank, the amount and type of enemies, but also your own playstyle. You could go seeking enemy tanks just fine, and in the earlier levels this is probably recommended for progress's sake. Later on though, enemies become more conniving and start to seek out your base rather than you, so you need to keep the siege mentality in mind and protect what's yours. There's a handy radar that gives a rough approximation as to where the bad guys are. There's little music in the game, which is a slight letdown, but the low grumble of the tank's engine and the weapon sounds certainly make up for it with the atmosphere they bring. This is a grand example of a game that doesn't need to be flashy or complex to be damned addictive. BattleCity is an absolute romp to play through, and it blows my mind that we didn't get it here. It's not massively different to the similarly named Battle Bull, although this is surely the superior of the two. Highly, highly recommended. One of the best Japanese exclusives out there. Osamu Higashio is a Japanese baseball Hall of Famer, and he is the focal point for this seemingly licensed baseball simulation game. I can only assume you need also to be a Hall of Famer for this to be remotely playable. From a quick glance at his Wikipedia entry, Higashio-san was renowned for his accuracy and ruthlessness when pitching, being infamous for actually hurling the ball directly at the opposing batter on the regular, leading to him actually being smacked in retaliation on more than one occasion. I have tons of respect for anyone trying to make the sport of baseball more entertaining, but can't help but feel like I'm actually at the plate facing his throws when playing this game. Your timing has to be spot on not to strike out, and then there's so much English on the pitches that you'll either hit a foul or almost certainly be caught. The furthest I've got one of my players is first base, after which the cyborg fielders catch me out literally every time I manage to connect with the ball, and I'm emulating this, save stating and changing the calibration of my shots slightly each time, and each time I get out. There is an increased intricacy to how you bat in this game. Normally it's a matter of positioning and timing, but here there's an added level of elevation. There's a bar that you access as the pitcher is winding up by pressing A. Here you can choose high, middle, or low, corresponding to where you think the pitch will come in. If the one you choose matches what the pitcher chose, you stand more chance of making a decent connection with the shot. You'll still get caught 99 times out of 100 though, but it'll be further into the outfield. I'll caveat this by saying there are a bunch, and I mean a bunch, of what appear to be team management sliders and stats during the team selection screens. I couldn't read them, and also I don't care, so I skipped through them all. Whether learning how to tweak all this would have any effect on the game, I don't know. I suppose some questions need to remain unanswered. Kanshuu does mean management or something similar to that, so it could be. Hey, on the positive side, this game is probably the best looking baseball game we've had so far. If that's what you want out of your sports games, then fair play to you. This title had a sequel the following year as well. It's an unashamed cash-in, however, changing absolutely nothing other than slight tweaks to the rosters. It plays exactly the same, with no let-up in the difficulty level. So, I'm not reviewing it. I don't care how famous the guy is. This was one of the first platform shooter games coming out in 1983. It was very popular in arcades due in part to its originality and relative ease of play. Secret Agent 17, Golgo 13's second cousin I believe, has to infiltrate a skyscraper. The game does this for you. You see him zipline down to the roof and break in. It's then your job to collect all the secret documents and then get to the ground floor where a getaway car will be waiting for you. Of course, you're not alone in this building. There will be an infinite army of enemy spies coming after you. They'll be shooting at you, but you can easily duck under their bullets or jump over them, and there's a long grace period before they fire, giving you plenty of time to put them down. You can shoot them back or run away from them, it doesn't matter. The main thing is acquiring these documents. Yes, it's a spy game of sorts, but getting in and out unnoticed isn't really the idea. You just turn up, blast holes in everyone, steal the stuff, and then leave. The name of the game comes from the elevators that you need to ride up and down. You can also fall a short way down the elevator shafts and ride escalators too. When in an elevator, you can go up or down, by pushing the relative buttons, and you can also ride on top of it if you need to. Be aware that you can't control it when you do, and can get crushed if it reaches the ceiling. Oh yeah, they won't stop if you're underneath either, so don't be dumb and just stand there. Because down is used to duck, but also control an elevator, you can't crouch within an elevator, so watch out for that. You jump with A and shoot with B. You can jump over an open elevator shaft. It's not hard to make it across, and also Agent 17 kind of kung fu kicks while he's jumping, which you can use in a pinch to get rid of an enemy or two. The enemies aren't tough to kill, they'll go down with one shot or kick usually, but there can be a lot of them, so be aware that you'll need to duck quite often. The documents themselves are hidden behind these doors with exclamation marks on them. There's usually 4 to 6 on a level, sometimes more. Don't try to leave before you collect them all, or you'll get put back by an exclamation door, plus you'll not be able to fire from this point. There are also question mark doors, behind which are hidden various weapons. Your starting pistol is pretty good as starting weapons go, but there's a shotgun that can take out several enemies at once, although the range and reload time isn't great, and a machine gun that rapid fires. Both are pretty good. You can get grenades, though. These suck. They are painfully slow and hard to hit with. It's possible to manipulate what weapon you get, it isn't random. Take a look at the 100 digit of your score. That determines what a door will yield. 0 or 100 gives you the shotgun, 2 or 300 gives you the machine gun, 4 or 500 gives you the pistol back, 6 or 700 will give you the grenades. 8 or 900 gives you some health back. Yeah, you get a health bar here, that wasn't in the arcade version. When falling, it's possible to shoot out some of the lights. If you can make one fall onto an enemy, it'll knock them out in a very satisfying way. It also increases your stealth a little, as it makes it tougher for you to be seen. At least, the enemies don't seem to shoot at you as much. At first, the opposing spies are all similar grunts, but later on they get a little more intelligent, and also have these attack dogs who are much quicker, and you have to crouch to shoot them. They're probably the toughest enemies. So there you have it, another Taito arcade port. This one's on the upper end of the scale in terms of a well-executed translation, and it's really great fun to play. Disappointingly, the UK version wasn't renamed Lift Action. It sounds like an overhyped selling point for toilet seats or something. One of the most memorable games of 1990 gets a welcome sequel at the absolute height of Konami's Game Boy dominance. 1991 was arguably the strongest year of the whole library, and this was in no small part to a veritable cornucopia of spectacular titles from Japan's finest. Called Nemesis 2: Return of the Hero in Europe, the name was changed to Gradius, presumably to be more recognizable to fans of the existing franchise. Whatever you know it by, this is again a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up made using the same scaffolding that we're all familiar with from the many games in this series. In essence, the same power-ups are available. You get a double shot, lasers, the option, up to 2 again. As usual, you can't have the double shot and the laser beams at the same time, but honestly, when you have the 2 option power-ups following you, you probably won't ever want to use the normal gun. Lasers are much more powerful and seem to hit multiple times per shot. Where the arsenal differs from the original Game Boy game is the missiles. Before, one of the improvements you could make was activating the ground-crawling missiles that dropped to the lower surface of the level and run rightwards until they kill something or go off the edge of the screen. They're very useful, as often there'll be land-based enemies that require skill to blast away. Any contact with the landscape results in your ship turning into a fiery inferno. Now, however, you get to choose between 3 missile configurations. The first is the normal one and can now be powered up a second time, firing more missiles. Alternatively, you can choose to fire the second power-up upwards, meaning you get one downward and one up alternately. The third choice is the same as the second, but now they actually fire behind you up and down. I'm torn as to which I prefer, and they all have merits. If you're seasoned enough to be good at mowing down front-facing targets, maybe the rear missiles will help you to take care of those sneaky little buggers that crop up from the left. You can also customize your double fire in 3 ways, and the laser weapon too. If you're not familiar with this game, be prepared for an amazing entrance. You're thrown right in the midst of a space battle, and it appears your side is losing. Your flagships are shot down, but you manage to escape in your little Vic Viper. Don't breathe a sigh of relief just yet though, as you're quickly preyed upon by a gargantuan spacecraft hell-bent on bringing you down. That's not all, you just happen to be trapped in an asteroid field, having to dodge colossal rock formations while not getting shot. This big beast is simply ploughing through them all, brushing the rubble aside, until at last you dart into a cave, which finally halts the large ship. It's only there that the game really begins, but that was a real thrilling intro sequence. The first level starts in a ruined city with serpentine aliens and mutant frog things. The serpents can be destroyed quite easily if you have the laser power, even more so with the 2 options following you. If you don't have these, you're probably not going to take them down, and they kill you on contact, so get those lasers going as soon as you can. Power-ups drop regularly depending on the difficulty level you've chosen. After leaving the ruins, you enter a fungal jungle of sorts, where the playfield extends above and below the screen, giving multiple paths in the way a lot of these games often do. This part is a bit easier, but then you enter another awesome looking cave where you'll meet the game's first end-of-level boss. This guy, or guys, is brutally hard. There are 2 heads embedded in a wall, both of which fire a trilogy of projectiles at you independently, and not in sync with each other. This makes your dodging pattern different for each round of bullets, so be alert. Also note that only the bottom head can be destroyed at first. After you manage that, the top one will fire out from the wall and slalom around. It's death on touch, of course, all the while throwing yet more shots at you. This is tough at first, but with a fully powered up craft and keen dodging skills, you should get past it. There are 5 levels, but it takes a good deal of time to get through. There are as many continues as you need, so you're really only limited by your own perseverance. Pick easy mode first, even if you ordinarily wouldn't. It's plenty hard enough even for pros. The game is really tough. Don't play this one before the original because you'll find the first one too easy if you come to it second. The music from Nemesis was the audio highlight from 1990. This might be even better. Konami always provided us with solid backdrops, but you'll hear sound effects that haven't featured in a Game Boy game up to this point. I wish I was half as clever as these folks were. The Interstellar Assault never stops surprising you. The backgrounds don't rely on much tile work. Quite often you'll see objects only once in-game, which is a level of effort we didn't often see. There are some genius transitions between stages. I won't reveal them all because watching them for the first time is like your reward for beating a level. Any that you manage to see, you'll have earned, believe me. After you exit the cave of the first boss, you're suddenly trapped in a beautifully animated tractor beam and taken aboard the massive ship that was chasing you at the start. This starts level 2, and the gorgeous attention to detail doesn't let up for a second, with these massive blast doors slamming shut behind you. This is about as immersive as a Game Boy game has been so far. I wish that I could give 11 points for graphics, it's that impressive. Do Game Boy games get better than this? Thinking back to how good Nemesis was in all 3 categories, I can't help but feel that the Interstellar Assault looks better, sounds better, and has a much more suitable level of challenge to it. It's as if the first game was simply training camp, and this one is where the big boys play. I don't know if it'll ever happen, but if I can ever no-hit this game, I'll die a happy man. Absolutely one of my favourite shoot-em-ups of all time. Phenomenal. Seems like a little while since we've played a block puzzle game, doesn't it? There were so many at the start of the Game Boy's life that by 2 and a bit years in, it seemed like developers were pushing the envelope more and trying different genres. Still, it's not always a bad thing to stay safe to a tried and tested formula now and then. Megalit sounds like the title of a Snoop Dogg song about, well, the thing that all his songs are about, but in fact it comes from the word megalith, a large stone used to build a structure or monument, such as Stonehenge or the portal tombs of rural Ireland. A witch has desires of power. She wants to rule the whole world by using magical jewels. She has abducted all the princesses, elves and fairies who have magic jewels from their castles, and has cast a Megalit spell on them. Our hero comes to the rescue, but quickly finds himself cast under the spell too, and is petrified. Not figuratively, literally turned to stone. In order to save the captive creatures and to break his own spell, he needs to solve Megalit's puzzle. There are 6 rounds of puzzles, each split into 5 screens. You play the hero who, while in the cutscene was a human, is now a Kirby-shaped boulder. In fact, you look a lot like the character in Flipple. There is a stack of big blocks, megaliths I suppose, arranged in various ways on top of each other. The idea is to get all of the blocks onto the bottom level of the screen. They can only drop 1 tile at a time, otherwise they'll smash, and you automatically lose the level. You can push or pull blocks by pressing B next to them to select and move left or right. It doesn't matter if it's underneath others, you can still move them regardless of the weight. The riding ones don't get dragged with you, but will drop down once they have nothing underneath. Basic physical laws such as gravity and friction don't apply here, but we can put that down to magic. Why do I always try to justify these things in a make-believe universe? Your character can jump 3 spaces and can step on the blocks as much as you need to, but beware if you push something that has another block on top, it'll crush you, so make sure you pull it out instead. You get a password every 5 levels, so every round. This is a simple 4-digit password, but then there are no lives and no score to keep track of. You can have as many goes as you need to for each puzzle, and can freely restart a screen by pressing select. The music is pretty much what we've come to expect by this point. It's cute and jolly, but more variation would have made it more palatable. I know it's not a paramount concern in puzzle games, but still it would be nice. The art style is unadventurous, but standard and operable. It does what it has to, no more, no less. That's fine though. It's more important to be able to judge things properly, as there's a lot of strategy and forward planning needed in this game. You can't just go pushing and pulling stuff around without due consideration for what's going to fall. Remember that things can only fall 1 space, and you can only manipulate them if there's something for you to stand on next to. If you run out of platform yourself, you'll fall off and will need to create a new one to use. You can line things up with half a tile of space sticking out, which you frequently need to do to pull off some of the more subtle tactics. Don't worry about it falling off. If there's the tiniest bit of a platform, The blocks above will be supported, even if it's just at one end. The game comes in 2 difficulty modes, Easy and Quest. Quest is essentially the same levels, but now you have a limited number of lives, and levels are timed. I didn't really bother with the harder difficulty. Once I'd beaten the first mode, I felt like I got everything out of Megalit that I was going to, and it didn't take that long. 30 levels don't stretch all that far. Quest mode should have had more than just time and life constraints to make it more challenging. A decent concept that was sadly just too short. Not bad though. You thought the world would be free of radioactive threats from the underground world after the events of the original Blaster Master. Yet for reasons unknown, radioactive energy is destroying every living thing on Earth. Only Jason can stop it. And this time, he can't use his super-equipped car. He's got to do it alone. Armed with blistering lanterns, mega-power hyper-bombs, and skull-rattling super-bombs, Jason must blaze a dizzying path deep down beneath the surface of the planet to seek out the mutant bosses, then destroy them. This wasn't a port of the 1988 NES game. We would get one, but not until the Game Boy Color came out. In fact, it's one of those that wasn't strictly a Blaster Master game. It's a sequel to Robo Warrior, which itself is a Bomberman spin-off. It's not much of a stretch though. The side-on overworld platforming levels that featured the tank aren't there in this game, the look more closely resembling the top-down cave stages. Each level, or period, takes place in this overhead perspective field that has various features such as water, trees, rocks, and so on. There are lots of different respawning enemies milling about, which you can shoot using A or attempt to kill using bombs that you place with B. There are 4 different types of bomb that you can lay. Your normal one has an infinite supply and a blast radius of 3 by 3 tiles. You can lay up to 4 of these at any one time, which comes in really handy against some bosses. The other 3 types of bomb you need to collect on the levels by collecting tiles that you blast out of the scenery or find in caves. These all have different blast effects. An arrow that fires off in the direction you were walking when you placed it, blowing up on each tile until hitting something indestructible. A cross shape that fires a 4-way shot horizontally and vertically, and one that spreads out in a kind of diamond shape. These last ones are the most destructive, the hardest for yourself to avoid, and the rarest to find. As in Bomberman, you can get caught in your own blast radius, which takes off half your health, and this is a common way to die when you start off. Once you place a bomb, you can't pass over it until it explodes, so be aware that you can easily trap yourself. Having unlimited standard bombs and being able to place 4 at a time, it's very tempting to go a little gung-ho and spam before realizing you're bombing your way into a corner. When I say that you need to essentially mine out the bombs from the scenery, there are things that look like trees that you need to destroy by planting bombs near them. Some will drop these icons with the different bombs on, others give you a shield or make you move faster. There are E icons that replenish your health, and 3 tools. These include a rubber ring that lets you move across water and a lantern that lets you see in the dark. Also, in a predetermined location there will be a key, which you need to find before the timer runs out in order to open up the exit. There are 9 worlds, each of which have anywhere between 2 and 5 stages. Each world culminates in a boss fight. These are pretty hard. They're usually massive hulking monsters of some description that move around the screen in a particular pattern and have a weak spot. They're often chasing after you, and you'll need to place bombs in their way at just the right timing. Don't bother trying to shoot them with your gun as it's weak as hell, and the beast will just run into you before you can get a shot away anyhow. They're all different though, which provides great variation. There's one behind a force field that shoots out its tongue toad-like at you. It can eat your bombs and is instant death if it gets you. Obviously, your ordinary bombs won't cut it here. You need to use the ones that fire off in a direction, timed just right to take him out. There's a massive serpent that extends its body across the whole screen until you're trapped. You have to quickly blow its head off so it retreats before you run out of room. This was the first part of the game where I really started feeling the pinch. With 9 worlds and 2 to 5 stages per world, there's something like 35 to 40 levels in Blaster Master Boy. The boss fights are the real highlight of the game, but sadly the variation is a little lacking throughout the rest of it. Only one song throughout, with a different one for the bosses, makes for quite a dull auditory experience as well. The gameplay is certainly fun, and provides an interesting hybrid between Blaster Master and Bomberman, but once you're 4 or 5 worlds in, you get the distinct feeling that the solitary mechanic has been spread slightly too thinly. Still, it's definitely one worth trying. A world without our most excellent compatriots Bill and Ted? No way. Yes way, if the Grim Reaper and the evil Bill and Ted robots get their way. Denomalos wants to totally change the future, and the only way to stop this most heinous dude is to travel through the circuits of time and collect the stolen time fragments. This game is not like the catastrophe that LJN came up with for the NES, although a lot of the same dudes were involved. It was wisely decided that the tried and tested strengths of the Game Boy should be stuck with, that of single-screen puzzle platform things. Here you have 10 adventures of 5 levels each, Bill and Ted taking it in turns, exploring different time periods and locations, from England 1456 to 1 billion BC, from Austria 1805 to the Abyss. You stop off at the schoolroom and the shopping mall along the way, of course. The premise of the game is to collect these shiny crystals that take slightly different forms in each world. You need to jump over obstacles and collect all the things, then make your way to a phone box that'll appear. There are enemies and traps aplenty, most of which are instant death on touch and none of whom can be killed. You jump with A and pick up certain tools using B. These question mark blocks feature on some levels, which house things inevitably necessary to complete a level. There are bombs that allow passage through walls, balloons that help you float up to the top, a cake thing that makes you jump further, and things that shield you from enemies or freeze them for a short while. Suffice to say, if they're on a level, you probably need them. Bad guys are varied and sort of relate to the time period in which they're from. You'll come up against Abraham Lincoln, Napoleon, Einstein, Billy the Kid, Socrates, and one of the Bee Gees. I'm guessing with that last one. I don't know why they want to kill Bill and Ted, why there are often more than one, or why they appear scattered all over various time zones. Possibly they snuck back with our wild stallions in the phone booth, like in the film. Although why Honest Abe is wandering around Austria in 1805 when he was born in the USA in 1809, I don't know. We'll put it down to Denomalos did it. The first 3 adventures don't give you a ton of hope that this game is going to be anything good. Levels are formulaic as hell with little redeeming features. You just collect the stuff, avoid the bad guys, and try not to let the accuracy of the jumps lead you to despair. Come the 4th one, the game does get more interesting, and this is where the puzzle aspect comes into play. Certain crystals won't appear until other ones are collected. Picking some things up take away platforms or ladders, in positive or detrimental ways. Enemies need to be manipulated to fall certain ways, or whatever. It's a shame it took until the 4th world for this to become a mechanic, as I'd not be surprised if a lot of players couldn't be bothered to get that far. Even when this is a thing, there's a lot of trial and error at times, so expect to die a few times before you figure out how certain levels work. You get new lives after every 5,000 points, with more points awarded for the speed you complete stages. This game has possibly the smallest character sprites I've ever seen. They're even more minuscule than those in Super Mario Land or Batman, and don't look anything like Keanu Reeves or the other one. This is kind of necessary in order to keep each level on one screen, and doesn't really hamper gameplay as there's little in the backgrounds anyway. I really wish there were, as it would at least start to legitimize having 10 different worlds to play through. There's no difference between how Austria and the ancient world look, nor the Abyss or Paradise levels. Seeing as how they're clearly meant to represent heaven and hell, they'd never say as much in a Nintendo game, of course, you'd think there'd be at least a certain distinction. The music is alright, although there's one song throughout the entire 50 levels. Overall, a Bogus journey is not without its moments. Some levels are quite clever in the way they play out, and I did work my way through the whole thing. Why license it though? The gameplay has nothing to do with the film in any way except the characters' faces before each adventure. Some of the time zones and characters are the same, and sure, there's a time-traveling phone box, but other than that, the game could have just as easily been done with Bugs Bunny. Did he have any Game Boy games? I can't remember. Now this is an American sport that I can get behind. Ice hockey's kinda like soccer, as in you're passing a thing freely around your teammates without having to worry about playing it in slightly the wrong direction or committing a nonsensical foul, with the intention of shepherding it into some sort of large, guarded receptacle. This time, however, you're travelling around at speeds that a bipedal human shouldn't be able to, on a surface we usually try to avoid with two lethal weapons strapped to your feet. Oh yeah, you also have a massive piece of wood in your hands, and can throw down your gloves and beat the crap out of opponents as part of the game. This sounds like a right laugh if you ask me. I certainly have fond memories playing the NES version of Blades of Steel. It was fast-paced, intuitive, and such great fun whether against a friend or the computer. The game didn't need learning. Whether you understood the sport or not, it was one that you could quite quickly pick up, and within a matter of minutes you were calling foul at your mate while wailing in on his face. From what I recall from that game, this one has a very similar feeling to it. Horizontally scrolling action, the best view aspect for a game like this in my opinion, that was zoomed out to just the right distance. That's just the start of the graphical successes. Oh my gosh, those interstitial cutscenes when you score are wonderful. I'm very impressed as to what they cranked out of the small capacity here. It looks great. Even when in the main overhead view, the animations of the players and referee are really polished. This game is not affiliated with the NHL, they had their own official games later on, but you can choose between 8 teams, 4 US and 4 Canadian, represented by the city that the team is based in. You can play exhibition or a tournament, in games of 3 periods of 20 minutes. The movement is really speedy, unlike a lot of sports games thus far. You pass using B and shoot using A. The passing mechanic is very sharp, just choose a rough direction and press the button. When in range of the goal, you'll see a fluctuating arrow where you're aiming. Try to time it for the area where the goalie isn't. There's a cool addition to the Game Boy version in that you can practice penalty shots and even the fight sequences. The fighting part is basically a button mashing exercise whereby you thrash at the other guy's face until he falls over. Still, it looks great and is a cool thing to have in there. Whatever rules there are in hockey, I'm sure there are plenty, there aren't many things that the referee calls you up on. There's something called icing, which is when you hit a puck from your own half and it crosses the goal line without being touched. That results in a penalty shot to the other team. Blades of Steel is frankly brilliant, and one of the best games to play with a link cable. I bought 2 copies for exactly that purpose, playing it with the same friend who owned the NES game all those years ago. We can testify how much fun it is, it was just like old times. I may even look into the sport itself as an alternative to football. If it's anything like this game, it'll be just violent enough to satiate my primeval bloodlust. The second Maruko-Chan game takes a totally different tack to the first. Whereas Okuzakai Daisakusen was basically a glorified rock-paper-scissors thing, Deluxe Maruko World somehow manages to give the player even less to do. This is actually less of a game. there are some minigames that are entirely inconsequential, and more of a visual novel, the kind you frequently find in the deep recesses of the Nintendo eShop. These certainly have a place if you like that sort of thing. You are essentially clicking dialogue options to take circuitous routes to the same destination, reading a whole bunch of text. I've been known in my more bored hours to dabble in a couple of these. The 2019 remake of You Know, A Girl Who Chants Love at the Bound of This World is probably the only one I actually saw the point in. Like that one, I do prefer them if they have some actual adventure elements. This one doesn't, and I'm not really comfortable giving it a score, as it's not a game, and isn't really a thing I understand the value of. I'm sure that value does exist for the right audience, so I'll leave it to them. Heck, it sold plenty of copies in Japan, so that demographic must exist. Another complex language barrier, sadly, but from what I can gather, the storyline in Jikuu Senki Mu is as cliched as they come, so I'm not gonna let it get in the way. In fact, this game ticks virtually every box on the build your own RPG checklist. A young, unready protagonist tasked to save the world by an ailing and misguided king, grinding experience points against weak monsters on the overworld in between trips to the inn to heal, while slowly building your finances to afford the better weapons and armor, finally feeling brave enough to venture to the first dungeon, and so on. Alright, you might not be able to read the game, but believe me, you've played it before. It's up to you whether you want to go through with it or not. It depends on whether being able to read a game bothers you that much. The menus are very straightforward, so you'll have no problem navigating your inventory and so on. I don't want to let any of this cloud my thoughts on the game, as it's actually an excellently presented piece of work. The art style, while not precisely original, is impressive enough to take you into the fantasy world, which is an achievement not always met on the Game Boy or even some home consoles. The overworld doesn't suffer from the blockiness of many early RPGs, and the map on the start menu is something I can't recall seeing on Game Boy before now. It's pretty accurate and does help you find where you're going. The music and sound effects give an efficient accompaniment to your adventure, and the sprite animations are exceptionally well drawn. There's a rudimentary character creation screen too, which is a nice early example of the concept. The problem is not with the language, it's with the rest of the content. Too many games like this existed already, so to stand out from the crowd, you either need the clout of name recognition like your Final Fantasy or Zelda games have, or do something interesting and maybe a little left field. The paths walked by Jikuu Senki Mu don't really take it to anywhere that either of these things are true, sadly, and it leaves the game wandering around the forgotten annals of a library where there are already plenty of RPG adventures that people do know about. It's a shame because this game does deserve a certain recognition. If you're a massive fan of the genre, perhaps think about giving it a dust-off for an hour at least. It's no surprise to anyone when I say RPGs are my personal favourite genre. I just love a game that is more than just a collect the things, shoot the things adventure. Compelling storylines, character development, saving the world on the grandest scale. Being able to dedicate hours to a thing like this feels like reading a fantasy fiction novel, except that you're actually in it. There are many successful franchises out there, with multiple entries spreading into double figures, and I don't need to name them. Of course, that's really just scratching the surface of what the RPG world has to offer. Many libraries have standalone titles hidden amongst the Final Fantasies and Dragon Quests of this world, and that's what we come across with Lenar's Knight Quest. You are a wannabe Knight of the Realm, 14-year-old Will, who pleads with his king to be allowed to undertake peril in search of fame and fortune, and other such hackneyed things. He acquiesces on the condition that you can return from the northern cave having slain a goblin. He gives you a sword, some armor, and a generous supply of gold. Once out in the big wide world, actually it's quite small in Knight Quest, you have a choice of going north or west. Are you gonna do what the king told you and head north? You'd better, because the monsters lurking to the west are much stronger and will kill you as soon as look at you. Grinding is present in most RPGs, but here it's not as necessary to hammer it as in other games. You'll level up pretty quickly. Press select to see the player's status screen, which shows you your inventory, weapons, armor, gold, and XP. All the usual RPG systems, such as combat, exploration, leveling up, etc., are about the simplest I've ever seen. This is so cookie cutter, it's almost a crime. You start off with level 1 armor and a level 1 sword, and can almost immediately buy level 2 upgrades from the shop in the starting town. Later on in the game, there are level 3 upgrades, and then you have the strongest arsenal. Or maybe there's a secret island that has some stronger ones? I wouldn't know about such things. Magic spells come in the form of items or scrolls that you also buy from the shop, and the only other items in-game are potions or hearts used to replenish your health. Leveling up is simply a matter of gaining enough XP and increases all your stats in a formulaic way. You don't learn any new skills or spells as you get stronger, but you'll have more HP and attack power. If you die in-game, it's not game over, but you lose half your money and return to the castle where you started the game from. Honestly though, that rarely happens if you're just sensible. The combat system is one of the simplest I've ever seen. Fights are always 1 versus 1, as in Will versus whichever monster he stumbled upon. The way the battles work revolves around these 4 sword techniques that you know from the beginning: Swallow, Falcon, Seagull, and Eagle. And like I say, you never learn new ones. Each monster has a particular weakness, sometimes 2, as if Will is penetrating different parts with different strokes, so once you learn which move works against which enemy, then the battles are an absolute doddle. This is kinda how Pokemon does it, I know, but those games' system is much more involved. You learn new techniques as your creatures get stronger, and at least the type bonuses, it's super effective, make a certain kind of sense, like how water puts out fire and so on. Here, there's basically no rhyme or reason to strengths and weaknesses, you just have to know that a Bleeb is weak to Seagull, and a Funky Orc to Falcon, and so on. Another thing that makes the game slightly too easy is that inns will only ever charge you 10 gold to replenish your health. It's not one of these affairs where your HP is considered. Pretty soon you'll get more than 10 gold for killing one enemy, so as long as you don't push your luck, you should never die and never spend more than you earn in inns. There is something like 20 to 25 areas in the game, as well as dungeons within some of these areas. Each one has a pre-arranged bunch of monsters wandering around, and when you kill one of them, it's gone until you leave the screen and come back on it. This way, you can easily kill 2 or 3 easy ones, leave and heal, and come back. There are no random encounters as you can see all the enemies straight away. Everything you can see looks professionally put together. The monsters are menacing while retaining a sort of anime charm, and while the tiles are not hugely varied, they still look pretty nice. The battle animations are a little drawn out, and you'll no doubt find them tedious after a short while. The music is short but sweet. Not all battles have the same tune over and over again, it seems to be monster specific. Overall, the presentation is quite enjoyable and won't grate on the player too much. Neither will the game, really. There's not a great challenge. It's a very linear adventure, with 6 or so quests given to you by the king in a specific order, all of which revolve around getting to a cave, dungeon, or tower, working your way to the heart, and killing some such goblin or witch. There are 1 or 2 little sidetrack things, such as having to find a key before you can open doors in this mansion, but it's literally 1 screen over, and will take you about a minute and a half to find it. This is not a bad game at all. I know I've been a little hard on it, but you have to appreciate the strength of the RPG library on the Game Boy, and Night Quest is tough to put in the same league as some of the wonderful titles that are so dear to my heart. Still, it's fun for the 3 hours it'll take to beat it. Whether you'll want to repeat the experience, I don't know. Good if you're hungover or sick or something. With the help of Ashibe-san, the door to the fantasy world has been opened. You get a letter from your pal Goma-chan telling you to bring your friends and come search for treasure. Choose from 4 worlds in this fantasy theme park, ranging from Dreamland to SeaWorld. Each mini-section presents you with a new quest to fulfill, from recovering something that a band of pirates stole to the mystery of the abandoned town. Your main character is Ashibe, but there are 3 others who follow you around. Your dolphin seal buddy, a woman called Peke, I think, and an old geezer called Taneta. The seal doesn't fight as such, but gives advice and tells you how battles are going and things like that. As you might gather from my rambling preamble, I don't really understand the story behind what's going on here, but what's obvious is Yuenchi Panic, or Amusement Park Panic, is another well-executed, if slightly insane RPG. One thing that strikes you as mad is the monsters that spawn through random encounters. You'll be fighting all sorts of random things, from land-based sharks to at least 2 different types of ice cream, a cup of soda, all sorts of weird and wonderful things, and these encounters are incredibly frequent. You can barely walk 10 steps without being accosted by something. The battle system is minimal. You choose one of your peeps and spam the attack command until the enemy dies. Not sure why only one of the party can be involved with a fight at any one time, but there it is. Each character has their own attack. Pepe sings the alphabet at enemies with a strong impact that hits perhaps 50% of the time. Taneta, with his massive fish lips, flings fireballs using his fringe. You know what? I'm gonna stop attempting to explain the storyline facets of this game, because everything I say makes it sound even more bonkers. The insanity is really only skin deep though. Upon closer inspection, you realise that this is kind of a generic RPG underneath the veneer of madness. Unfortunately, not enough of the strong aspects of a generic RPG were explored. There's very little strategy and even less team building. You never get a sense that your characters are growing in strength, and as far as I can tell, there's no overarching story connecting the 4 levels. It's kind of a shame, as the graphics are delightfully wacky, and the accompanying soundtrack is truly excellent. For some strange reason, I get the feeling this was never intended to be a game taken seriously. I wonder what gave me that idea. The game of guts and glory. Oh yeah, we're into the big leagues now. One of the most famous sports games of the 80s made its way onto Nintendo's handheld in late 1991. Before starting to write this book, Tecmo Bowl was the only experience I'd ever had with American football. That was on the NES, of course, and even then we were in a very small minority around my school. The game was never released here, so I don't know how the hell my friend got a copy of it, but the artwork is unmistakable. There's so much reminiscent here. The artwork is brilliant throughout, with the 2 teams easily differentiable. Score a try, well, they're called touchdowns, a try is what a conversion is called here, and the same high quality of animation is present, fist bumps and taunting all around. The sounds are fantastic. The whistle sounds like a whistle, which is more remarkable than it probably should be. And although you don't get the indefinite hut 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 thing until you start your play, there is an assimilated bleep that is a decent tribute. The music is great too, and changes whether you're attacking or defending. You can choose from 12 teams from the original game, adapted from the 1988 NFL season, despite this game coming out in 1991. The teams don't have their adapted franchises. The Broncos are just called Denver, for example, but seeing as how Tecmo partnered with the NFL Players Association, the proper players are still there. And you'll be delighted to hear that you can still give the ball to Bo Jackson, remember him, and beat pretty much everybody. Race your friends to select Los Angeles because you're probably winning if you do. The controls render the game very accessible. When attacking, you basically give the ball to your running guy depending on which of the plays you choose. Every time the ball goes dead, you can select several plays. Running plays that are aimed at dodging through the defensive lines, or passing plays where the aim is to intersect them by passing to a runner. When defending, you can easily see which player you want to accost the quarterback or intercept a pass, and at breaks in play, the chosen tactics are equally as intuitive. The beauty of the original Tecmo Bowl was its ability to welcome in players from outside of the sports fandom. My friends and I knew nothing about the game, except that you had to get the rugby ball into the different coloured bit at your opponent's end of the pitch. You got 6 points instead of just 1, and you could then have a kick at the giant tuning fork to try and get another point. Still, it wasn't half fun dive tackling people for the hell of it and trying to dodge around your buddy's players. The translation to the Game Boy is actually very impressive. When I started playing, it felt like I'd never left, despite not having played any rendition of this game for nigh on 2 decades. I even did a thing. I was up 6 points to nothing. I love you, Tony Dorsett, whoever you are. I've never felt like such a jock in all my life. It's a weird sensation to be both hyped and disheartened at the prospect of having to review a video game, but that's what I get here. The first in the Aretha trilogy was one of the most intriguing RPGs so far. It was close to a work of art, but one that had a really high language barrier, to the point where I nearly couldn't review the game properly. It was exhausting to translate, but honestly resulted in an incredibly enriching experience overall. We rejoin Materia on her 18th birthday as she returns to her homeland, Aretha, to find her friend Duel, so she can invite her to her birthday party. Upon coming home, she finds that it has changed somewhat. Howard was defeated in the first game, and Sybil and Emilita have succeeded the throne. But from the shadows, the evil mage Warwick has stolen the magical item Aretha. Seriously, you couldn't have picked a different name, that can freely alter the terrain of the Aretha world. You can expect certain things in these games, one of which is the necessary work to put in before you're ready to embark on your quest. Apparently, Materia forgot all of her skills and lost all of her equipment in the years between the two stories. Again, the grind isn't too bad. Once you get to a certain level, the enemies realize they'll get owned and just won't attack you. It's a good indication of where you're at, while also keeping the game non-cheesable. You level up quickly, and your HP replenishes each time you do. Buy the expensive sword. Sure, it takes up the majority of your money, but with it, you can much more easily smash the weak first area enemies. Note that defeating enemies doesn't give you a reward straight up. They'll typically drop a chest, which you have to decide to open or not. Of course, you're going to. These have money or items in most of the time, but every now and then another monster will jump out of it. Blinded and disoriented supposedly, and you'll be flung into another battle. Sometimes you'll find a magical capsule inside, which can hold pretty much any consumable in the game. You could find a really high-end potion that could get you out of a bind, or use it towards the end of a dungeon only to get teleported away. There are 3 slots in your party, and 2 of them are filled almost straight away by Materia and Duel. The third of the trio sees various characters swap in and out as the game goes on. One of the cooler features of the original game was the Party Talk function. You can now access this at basically any time by pressing start. And seeing as how this is a more companionable adventure than the largely solo affair from before, this will be both useful and charming. The rest of your menuing is accessed via the select button and is reasonably efficient to use. You choose your weapons, armor and so on from the list, pressing A on it to bring up a use message, then that's the one you're using. A lot simpler than having to transfer an item to a party member and then having to figure out how to equip it. Every step saved is a little less translation energy expended, so I'm thankful. The battle system is standard turn-based stuff. Select an enemy, then a weapon, and so on. But the animation and sound effects have some real heft to them, and the monster sprites are excellently drawn. The presentation, as before, is absolutely impeccable. Heck, it's better if anything. Some of the scenery and stills, especially in the home city, are reused, but they were superb in the first place, so I don't really have a problem with it. A stunning looking game and a cracking soundtrack to go with it. One thing that stands out compared to the original, however, is how slow your character moves. It's like she's sleepwalking a lot of the time. You can now move diagonally though, and it's not locked into the grid. Think Link's Awakening, but at half the speed. Don't worry though, press select and choose the bottom-most option. This is your settings menu, and you'll see two options related to speed. The top one affects the text boxes, but the bottom affects Materia's movement speed. An oddball thing to find in a system menu, but there it is. Aretha II is every bit as accomplished as the first game in the series. Without hyperbole, I will say it's one of the greatest looking games on the whole system, and I don't write that easily. I would recommend you at least try to keep up with the storyline as it adds so much, but ultimately you'll still get something out of the game should you not be able to. It blows my mind that A, Yanaman didn't do more stuff like this, and B, there has never been any Western release of this trilogy. An absolute crime, if you ask me. There was a reason that isometric games are few and far between on the Game Boy. A very, very good reason. I've not always had the most enjoyable times with isometric games. The whole up, down, left, right thing is a little too ingrained in my instincts that messing about with it usually confuses me too much. Here, that's the case. To maintain a more visual 3D aesthetic, altered space is presented at 45-degree angles, meaning rather than the usual crosshairs, you move your character along the diagonals. In the non-analog age, there were two ways to tackle this. Firstly, you could set the controls the way that they're presented. Press left and down to move diagonally left and down, up and right to move diagonally up and right. The problem with this is that you're constantly pressing two directions just to move in a straight line, which isn't the easiest thing in the world to do. The other way you can do it is to set the 4 cardinal directions on the D-pad to correspond to a diagonal direction in-game. This is the method opted for here. Pressing down on the D-pad moves your astronaut down and to the left. Left moves him up and to the left, and so on. The obvious stumbling block for idiots like me here is this. Why is down pressed for diagonally down and left, and not diagonally down and right? Why does up on the D-pad move you up and right, and not up and left? I suppose the answer is that it has to be one or the other, so the developers just chose one. But you're screwing with habits that I've had for 30 years here, people. What seems like the simplest of remedies is something I just cannot get my little mind around. Try as I might to get to grips with an isometric control scheme, it's just not something I can program myself to do. The number of times I mess up in altered space because I've pressed a direction that I didn't intend makes me question myself. That's not the fault of the game per se, as they were fully committed to implementing this 3D style. What is the fault of the game is the unreasonable level of difficulty programmed into the game on top of the control scheme. There's so much in this adventure that kills you in one hit. The spaceship has spikes on around 85% of its flooring, which seems like an ergonomic nightmare, as if space travel wasn't enough of a challenge. Conveyor belts leading to death act as your only platforms. You have to pick up crates and drop them in the air in order to propel yourself mid-jump. Enemies that are instant death on contact just so happen to be hiding right behind a doorway. So, what's this game about, anyway? Well, the storyline is actually pretty cool. It's 2020 AD, and Humphrey the astronaut is making the first manned flight to Mars. We overshot that prediction by a little bit, but hey, Elon Musk is only one man. During the trip, his craft's engines shut down, so he ventured outside to try to fix them. Next thing he knew, he awoke in the bowels of this alien craft. Humphrey has found himself on the lowest level of the ship and needs to make his way to the top floor so he can blast out in the escape pod. Problem is, these aliens don't breathe oxygen, but a noxious chlorine gas, so Humphrey must check his air supplies at all times. To pick anything up, you must first jump on it and then press A. Just touching something, as in every single platformer ever, isn't enough. Why are you like this, game? There are a scant handful of items to help you out anyway, and they're all single use, so provide very limited relief against the vast hordes of aliens and robots attacking you. You can replenish your air supply, but be aware that any damage that you take will puncture your suit a little bit and take off some air. This goes down on its own anyway, as if the game wasn't challenging enough. Another brutal aspect of the game is the labyrinthine nature of the place. Each room you enter has a tricky puzzle of some kind, whether it's navigating invisible block sections, which you have to purely guess a lot of the time, or just figuring out how to not get destroyed by the droids. This is made doubly agonizing when you make your way to a door, only for it to lead to a dead end. What's more, you don't get any sort of map until you find a computer interface. This is according to the manual. I've never found one in-game. What music there is works well, although it is foregone through large chunks of the game in lieu of some ambience. This also works pretty well and fits the atmosphere of the game in a similar way to how Metroid 2's Spartan soundtrack did. It's not up to that level, of course, but there's nothing to complain about here. The detail in the room design is very good, but this doesn't help you. It's almost overkill in places. There's too much going on. What's more is that even though we're working with a little screen, only a portion of it is used. Coupled with the bizarre feel of trying to navigate the 3D aspect, makes this game feel really messy and terribly difficult to judge jumps. That's a real problem because jumping is, around 95% of what you need to do. Wondering why there were so few isometric games on the Game Boy? Altered Space should tell you all you need to know. Long before we all had a magic shiny box with all the world's information on it in our pockets, even before most homes had internet access, people had to walk to the local library to, shock horror, read books in order to learn stuff. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? Well, not anymore. The good folks at Imagineering presented us with a series of 5 helpful little tools for our own portable device. Facetiousness aside, these InfoGenius cartridges were actually pretty revolutionary. You had access to a French or Spanish language translator, meaning you didn't have to carry them pesky phrasebooks around with you. There was also a travel guide that saved you from carrying a pesky travel book around with you. Okay, I know I'm not selling this that well, and yes, realistically, how is a Game Boy any more convenient than, say, a diary or an actual calculator? You're right, it isn't. But look, I think these are really cool, alright? Sure, their usefulness might be questionable, but this was the first time that I can think of that we had anything like this. More pertinently, the InfoGenius series were the first set of carts that had any real educational value. There would be many more later on that were much more useful, helping Japanese speakers learn English, helping kids learn their maths and spelling, helping gamblers win at the horse racing, and it was this neat little collection that got the ball rolling. A slightly out there title is 1987's Crystal Quest. There's a reasonably good chance you've never played it. Originally on the Apple Mac and Apple II GS, it was notable for its fast-paced gameplay and for being the first game to utilize the Macintosh 2's color displays. You control this little circle spaceship, and in each wave you have to collect all the crystals in the playfield, a single screen area, after which a doorway at the bottom will open for you to fly through. Attempting to thwart your efforts are constantly spawning aliens from portals on either side of the screen. These are relentless in their approaches and appear quickly without notice. You can shoot at them with your gunship's infinite ammo, or activate one of your smart bombs to clear out all visible enemies and projectiles. As well as the small crystals, there are larger ones that give you tons of points, as well as extra lives and smart bombs to replenish your stocks. These are optional, but plentiful, and quite necessary should you want to get far into the game. The initial difficulty you'll have is getting accustomed to the movement of your craft. The original titles were mouse-driven and heavily inertia-based. This was retained as much as was possible with the D-pad, and as a result, what you contend with is a very slippery, almost ice physics-y movement. It's fast too. Hitting anything is instant death, as you would imagine, with no real cooldown period after a respawn. The movement isn't even the toughest thing to get to grips with. Your firepower is governed by your inertia too. You fire in the direction and at the speed that you're moving. This of course means that you need to be flying towards enemies in order to shoot them. You don't need me to tell you how hard this is, I'm sure you can imagine. Death is quite common, which is possibly why you get so many extra lives in Crystal Quest. You pick them up without noticing. Don't think this will help a great deal though. What's more helpful is the abundance of the smart bombs. With shooting being so tricky, I rarely even tried it, instead focusing on my collection quest and dropping a bomb if it got a little too overwhelming. You'll pick up 2 or 3 on each wave anyway, and if you're astute, it doesn't take that many to save your bacon. There are lots of different enemies with varying movement and attack patterns. Some can be shot, but not all. Some explode on death, leaving a fiery blast radius that you need to avoid. As well as this, there are mines that cannot be taken out, but of course are death upon contact. As long as you can get the movement down, then they shouldn't trouble you too much. The biggest source of cheap deaths is trying to collect a crystal that's over one of the enemy portals. There's an awfully good chance that something will spawn just as you're picking it up, leaving absolutely no time to dodge. There's no telegraph that something's coming either, you're done. It feels really cheap every time it happens. In the end, I resorted to flying across the doorway at full speed and activating a bomb just as I crossed it. It works sometimes, but other times you just fly into something else anyway. Waves progress quickly, with a time bonus for quick completion. You can get through them in a handful of seconds. I don't know how many there are, but I've hit wave 70 or something. Enemies get more varied and mines more abundant. Other difficulties crop up too, such as your exit door moving at faster and faster speeds, meaning just leaving a stage becomes a challenge. This game suffers on the original Game Boy from a really bad shadowing, to the point where playing it becomes harder because of the hardware itself. It's just too fast. The blurring is non-stop, and because of the pixel-perfect collision detection, presents a really unappealing prospect. Put it in your Game Boy Advance or something, or else expect pain. The graphics themselves aren't too bad though, even if everything is minuscule. It's easy enough to differentiate between collectibles and things that'll kill you, and the level of sprite animation is quite impressive for so small a bunch of characters. The music is non-existent though. Instead, we get decent shooting and explosion sound effects, as well as the noises when crystals are collected. I'm not sure what that level completion sound is supposed to be, however. It's a sort of mildly orgasmic groan. It makes me a smidge uncomfortable for some reason. All in all, this is reasonably good fun. Despite the apparent toughness, the game is generous enough to let you progress. Give it a whirl. Another one of those arcade titles that seemingly made its way onto everything in the late 80s and early 90s is Gauntlet II. Originally a 1986 arcade release, this hack-and-slasher dungeon crawler was on NES, Master System, several different home computers, including a particularly memorable Amiga adaptation, and more. The one I'm concerned with is the Game Boy one. The idea is to get as far as possible through these dungeons without dying, making your way to the exit of each level, killing or running away from enemies. You move around and can shoot in 8 directions. I say shoot, but you're usually throwing axes or whatever. The game has a timer in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen that starts at 2000. This is both your timer and health counter. As you go along, this will tick down, as if your overall health is linked to your character's hunger or tiredness or something. If it drops to 0, that's game over, and Gauntlet games always feature permadeath. Getting hurt by an enemy takes off a chunk from this number, but you can replenish it by finding food items like meat. You first choose your character by choosing a direction, left for an elf, up to choose a warrior, right for a Valkyrie, and down to play as a wizard. The elf, Questor, is quick and has decent magical abilities, but suffers in armor and firepower. Thor, the warrior, has no magic, but is a tank in terms of physical strength. Thyra, the Valkyrie, is my favourite character as she's super quick and has a really good defense level. Her firepower isn't the best, but she can still kill a lot of enemies with one hit. Lastly, Merlin is the strongest magically as you'd guess, but is best kept out of the hand-to-hand stuff as he doesn't wear armour. The levels are randomised in every aspect, including level layouts. This roguelike element adds longevity to your experience, provided you don't hate the gameplay, of course. As with all games in this vein, it's not just learning the various mechanics that's the key to victory. You also need a bit of luck in finding health or key drops at just the right time. The exit needs to show up in an area you can get to without having to mow down hundreds of monsters. The chances are that you won't be lucky on every floor, however. You need to find as many keys as possible on your travels, as these help you to progress at a reasonable clip. Gates and locked doors require keys to open up, but if you're stranded without a key, you can wait by the door and eventually it will unlock itself. This is kind of handy because of the random nature of the level layouts. You don't want to get super far into the game only to fail because of some silly softlock that won't let you pass a certain part, through no fault of your own. The random nature of the game can often throw up some really interesting level designs. Occasionally, all the walls on a stage could be invisible, an exit might be a fake, certain walls may morph into a heck ton of enemies when you touch it, lots of cool little features. There's also the possibility of finding a secret room, which can be achieved by completing specific achievements within the level. Sometimes when you start a level, you'll get a message such as "Don't be fooled," which means that if you find the real exit first amongst the fake ones, you'll go to the secret room. Within here, you can find food and magic potions, which can increase your shot strength, speed, power, and so on. It can be a little off-putting trying to decipher things when you start playing the Game Boy version of Gauntlet 2. The game was never known for amazing graphics, but here, it's often really tough to distinguish between objects. What's a treasure chest or what's an enemy's nest, for instance? There are always hordes of enemies lurking behind walls and such, and this was certainly attempted here, but often the game suffers lag because of the sheer number of moving sprites on screen. It's to be expected, though, and does actually make your responses a little easier to pull off. At first listen, the audio might sound pretty horrendous, but it's actually had a lot of effort put into it. Effort doesn't always equate to quality, of course, and as we saw with the Chessmaster, overusing digitized sound can often be really painful to listen to. It's very raw in Gauntlet 2, but there is an abundance of different sounds and speech in the game. The Gauntlet Fugue stands as the one and only song in the whole game, and it's pretty rancid. It's the speech in particular that sets the sound apart here. Your character of choice is heartily welcomed at the start of your adventure, and throughout you'll hear lots of messages like, "Valkyrie, your life force is running out," and "Valkyrie, you're about to die." Sure, it's muffled, but still intelligible, and hey, it's there. Not many sound engineers risked it during the 8-bit era, even less so on the Game Boy. It's never worked as well as this to my recollection, certainly not on the Game Boy, The only other ones that spring to mind as being as good is Pikachu's voice acting in Pokemon Yellow, which was performed by Ikue Otani herself, don't you know? And the "Let's Get Busy" voice at the start of levels on Hammer and Harry. Both those games came much later on, however, so this was quite an admirable effort for 1991. For anyone familiar with the Gauntlet series, it should go without saying that these games are more fun in co-op mode, and that's certainly true here. Linking with a friend enables two warriors to journey through the game independently of each other. You don't have to be on the same screen, so can mix it up between branching out and holding firm together. So far as I'm aware, this is the only version of Gauntlet 2 where players' movements are not limited to the single screen shared between them. Quite the achievement. I'm sure Gauntlet 2 is not for everyone. It's pretty hard, and I've no idea if there's an ending to the game or if you just futilely venture on until you die. There's a lot to get used to in this game, but give it your time. Think how faithful to the arcade this port tried to be. The sound, graphics, and gameplay will grow on you, and you'll have a lot of fun. It's truly remarkable how marketing teams can shoehorn a brand onto something. If you're not aware, and why should you be really, Cool Spot was Dr. Pepper's red circle with limbs and sunglasses, who for some reason was chosen as the flag bearer for the hyper-sugared, carbonated toilet cleaner 7-Up, replacing Fido Dido in the late 80s. The anthropomorphic circle was a really lazy mascot, cool only in that 90s way of simply putting sunglasses on it, akin to filling Poochie's shades in. Thrown together in about half an hour on a Friday afternoon, just so the work experience kids could bunk off to the pub early. Whether or not this character justified having its own game, in fact several different ones, is open for debate, but what is not arguable is that the laziness of Spot's overall persona was definitely carried over onto its first Game Boy game. The one that you probably remember is not this one. Spot the Cool Adventure, also known as McDonaldland here in Europe, came out in 1992, and 1994 saw Virgin Interactive's platformer Cool Spot. The first time we saw Spot on a portable system was here in Spot the Video Game, and is a board game that is a pretty close approximation to the earlier one, Othello. I didn't massively enjoy that game. It was an okay idea, with AI that rendered the game inaccessible, and this one isn't much better. The rules are not identical, but the overall concept is the same. You have a 7x7 board, and the aim is to either fill the play area with your coloured pieces, or at least have the most spaces occupied once all the spots are taken. This is done by following very basic rules. On each turn, a player selects an existing piece of their colour, and then an empty position 1 or 2 squares away. If the selected location is 1 space away, then a new piece is created in that location. If 2, the chosen piece moves to that new place. In either case, all adjacent pieces that have been laid will flip to that player's colour. Graphically, it's about as good as it needs to be. No boundaries were pushed here, to be sure. It's something of a moot point, of course. Nothing was done that didn't need to be done to make the game playable. There's a weird little quirk that the programmers couldn't have anticipated, however, and it's something that cropped up quite a few times with the dawn of the Game Boy Color and its palettes. That system, and consequently the GBA after it, uses different palettes for static and moving objects. Most of the time this isn't really a problem. You may be most familiar with this occurrence when Ash's baseball cap is a different shade to his body when commencing a battle in the first-gen Pokemon games, only to revert to the same colour once the screen wipe is finished. Here, however, because the piece in play counter has an animation, its shading is actually different to the pieces on the board. So if you're playing on a console with a colorized palette, make sure you hold B and left when first turning the Game Boy on to choose the grayscale color scheme, else you're gonna have a hard time. Audibly, Spot the Video Game is pretty dull as well. The whole thing is a basic affair with little variation that is slightly less appealing than the NES version. I have no real sweet tooth and can't really stomach soda drinks. This game is about as synthetic as the drink it's based on. Give me a beer any day. Okay, RoboCop, I get. Who Framed Roger Rabbit is understandable. Even the Lawnmower Man has some merit, what with the virtual reality thing. But Navy SEALs? Okay, it's got explosions, gunfights, and gratuitous killing, but it is, without hyperbole, one of the dumbest films I ever saw. Even a team of 4 writers couldn't prevent it from being one of Charlie Sheen's worst. And for the early 90s, that's really going some. The first thing I want to remark upon is that awesome intro music. One of the first few songs on the system that I can think of in 7/8 time. The range of sounds used really could have come from the Game Boy Color's larger memory banks. It's not from the film, but an original composition. The sound effects in-game are good as well, although I'm not sure what that barking noise is meant to be, but the soundtrack is excellent throughout. Following the plot of the movie, you control a single Navy SEAL and have to fight through 5 levels, gunning down an endless horde of stereotypical turban-wearing terrorists. The levels are a mixture of linear and non-linear, with some exploring parts in there, but ultimately the aim is to get to the exit door on each stage. You can crouch and even walk like that, as well as climb to platforms above you. Your SEAL is an agile character, but annoyingly can only shoot horizontally. With so many enemies above or below you, more of a Contra-style shooting mechanic would have made the game more enjoyable. You only fight 1 enemy in the whole game. The aforementioned terrorists armed with 2 daggers, and kill you instantly with the slightest contact. For a Special Forces soldier, your chap is painfully weak. The AI of the enemies is poor, in that you can quite comfortably jump over one who's running at you, and they'll just continue running in that direction, leaving you free to shoot them in the back. There is a timer per stage, indicated by a burning fuse in the lower left, so you can't hang around. Your ammo is not infinite, but there are plenty of places to replenish it, and you can also find a machine gun that fires a larger shot and does more damage. You can also call on your sniper guy a handful of times, who'll clear the screen of anyone if it's getting a bit too hectic. Other than that, it's the same deal. Mr. Sheen used grenades a lot in the film, and it would have been cool to have them at your disposal here, but sadly not. The game mostly looks very good. I'm a little uncomfortable that your guy doesn't appear to be wearing trousers. This is especially gross when he's climbing to a higher level, as his posterior is a little too naked looking. The shading on the backgrounds and foreground objects was done exquisitely, and the interstitial pictures between levels were given a lot of attention. They look great. You're literally just shooting anyone that moves until you reach the final exit. So at the start of a level, it'll tell you your objective, which could be something like rescue the hostages, but in-game you do no such thing. You just reach a door and then get a picture saying, "Congratulations on rescuing the hostages." You don't see any of these hostages. Apparently exiting through a door is enough to free them. It's also all you need to do to destroy the terrorist base. There's no final boss, no bosses at all actually, and just the single enemy throughout the whole game. With so much care and attention put into the graphics and music, it's a massive letdown that the game is frankly so tedious and empty. The Gaiden spin-off quadrilogy of the Surtech Wizardry series of RPG games marked the first Japan-developed sub-series in the franchise. There were 4 games in this collection, 3 of which were released on the Game Boy, with a 4th on the Super Famicom. These were hardcore JRPGs, that's a fact, and were certainly not for the weak at heart. Limited to Japanese release, the 3 titles have since been given the fan translation treatment to open them up to curious English speakers. Japanese language RPGs are plentiful on the system, this we know, but few are renowned for being great, like this trio. The story behind the first part in the Wizardry Gaiden adventure concerns an artifact known as the Staff of Genilda. This staff provides magical protection to the locale in which many wizardry titles take place in, the city of Lilgamin. Unfortunately, the power of the staff is waning, leading to the Queen dispatching her sister, Sorks, and the rogue mage Taros into one of the many nearby dungeons to try and resolve this crisis. The nightmare was only exacerbated when neither returned from the quest. It's up to you to create a party of adventurers, find them, and save the city. The first thing to do in-game is to create your fearless band of warriors. You can take with you up to 6 individuals who subscribe to various classes and skill sets. The main city screen has several icons. The top right one has 2 crossed swords and is the first place to visit. This is the training screen, although you don't so much train as simply choose your characters. You have various stat points designated initially in 6 areas, and a handful of bonus points that you yourself need to attribute to them. Strength determines your physical damage done and the hit rate for all physical attacks. Vitality is the amount of HP a character can receive when they level up. Agility determines the likelihood of you avoiding attacks, fleeing, or disarming traps successfully. Intelligence is the effectiveness and success rate of mage spells. Piety is a similar thing but for priest spells. Luck is your resistance to status effects and also affects the chances of rare items to drop. Where you add the points decides what classes the character can be assigned to. There are 8 classes, not all of which are attainable at first, and all have certain stat requirements. For instance, a character can only be considered a fighter if they have at least 11 in strength. A mage needs 11 intelligence, and so on. You also have to choose the character's alignment, good, neutral, or evil. Not only does this decide whether characters can team together, you obviously can't have good and evil in the same party, but certain classes can only be populated by certain alignments. Samurai can only be good or neutral, ninjas can only be evil, and so on. Once you've created enough players, go to Gilgamesh's Tavern to sign them up. Afterwards, the castle in the middle of the screen will be your go-to place for quest advancements. Once you find out what the Queen wants you to do, the bottom right icon will take you to the dungeon. It turns out that Taros is conducting illegal experiments in this dungeon, and Princess Sorks has gone missing. Our quest thusly begins. I'm going to let you go into this dungeon somewhat blind for a minute. Done it? Did you die? Did you die quickly and often? Me too. Like I say, this game is about as hardcore as RPGs get in my experience. Yes, you'll need to grind your sword arm to a stump to get anywhere. Don't descend further than the first floor until everyone in your party is at least level 3. I'm not kidding. You'll need to climb out, heal, go back in, and so on. Usually battles only occur when you open doors, so at least you probably won't get sprung upon and die on your way back to the inn. Stick near the entrance too, because as you may notice, these labyrinths are really confusing until you get a map spell later on. I could go on forever about the storyline and gameplay, as it is truly excellent, but I'm running out of space, and there are other things that need mentioning. Anyway, if you've played an RPG before, and if you're tackling this, I sincerely hope you're no rookie, then you'll have no trouble figuring out what to do. It's just being good enough to do it that's the problem. What needs remarking on is the dungeon graphics. They are pretty special, it has to be said. The textures and draw distance are outstanding, drawn tile-based from a first-person perspective. You rotate 90 degrees by pressing left and right, turn right around by pressing down. Up or A moves you forward. There are lots of passageways, it's a veritable maze down there. The way that all these different corridors, chutes, and doorways are put together look great. It's a good thing too, because it's so easy to get lost and would be made worse if you couldn't tell what you were looking at. I adore the images of the creatures you'll be fighting, and the boss battles look truly immense. The music is right out of a typical fantasy fiction game, with melodies ranging from folky to suitably dark and menacing. Sound effects are used sparingly, but are always effective. A cool feature of these 3 games is that you can transfer your characters forward through the series, garnering a real attachment to the lives you've created. It's not an easy thing to do. You have to have found and sold all items in the game, but then you'll get a password that lets you keep your intrepid heroes for the next adventure, coming in 1992. Should you try Wizardry Gaiden 1 Suffering of the Queen? I'm not sure. How brave are you feeling right now? Bunched together with seemingly 100 other Japanese exclusive RPGs comes one that finally stands out from the crowd. That's not a mark on quality. Walk down the street naked and you'll stand out, so don't take the words at face value. Almost to the opposite way that Yuenchi Panic tried to do it, that game was mad as all get out on the surface, but basically paint by numbers when you got down to it. The Legend of Xerd, for all appearances, looks like your super standard adventure RPG, but once you start playing and getting into the story, you'll realize it's a weird old sausage for a different reason. In fact, the game comes across almost as a parody of the genre at times. You don't play as the eponymous Xerd, but in fact a young boy named Jake. Jake's twin brother happens to be the bad guy you're hunting for, and to do this, you need to first find a reincarnation of Xerd himself. You'll soon meet a girl called Mana, who joins you in your quest. A little way down the road, you'll come to the first of many strange towns in the game, whereby the townspeople will proclaim that you have to marry each other, because of some bizarre religious calling they claim to have heard. Even more bizarrely, the couple just go along with it. 5 minutes more down the road, and Mana gives birth to a boy in one of the most transparent nods to Immaculate Conception you've ever seen. The town priest, not the parents by the way, can we just highlight that for a second, names the child Xerd. Because what else, right? Oh, but it gets weirder. They baptize the child in this special fountain that immediately transforms the babe into a fully grown human man, complete with speech and fighting skills, who nonchalantly agrees to join his mum and dad on what has now become a real Swiss Family Robinson adventure. And the game goes on from there. It's not just the storyline, it's the completely blasé manner that these story beats play out. The characters just sort of accept all this cataclysmic stuff that happens to them, almost as if the protagonists know they're just acting out a game. It ain't the end of the world, you know. The more you explore, the more you realize how little of this game actually is generic. At first, you might not appreciate the art style as anything more than your standard, blocky 8-bit adventure RPG, but just look at some of the detail in the enemy pictures and the delicate shadings on the tiles. The music might at first seem like nothing more than a competently composed fantasy world soundtrack, but then you hear the comedic digitized screams when you kill an enemy that are different pitches based on the size of the monster. There's a bunch of peculiar little moments throughout that you'll find if you play the game with an eye for detail, a very comedic approach to the traditional format. I particularly enjoyed the imposter king boss about halfway through. When you manage to depose him, one of the villagers simply remarks, "New king wanted." There is a town called Doctor that is filled with doctors, and one called Magician that is filled with, well, magicians. Xerd no Densetsu is solely a Japanese game, unfortunately, but if you're not bothered about the text, you should be, by the way, that's the maddest part, then it's more than playable anyway, as the traditional attack, magic, item, etc. menu options you'd usually have are replaced by handy little icons of swords, satchels, and so on, which makes me wonder why more games didn't do that. Thanks so much for watching this video. Let me know your thoughts on the game down below, and if you can spare a second, give the review a quick thumbs up, it really helps out. Subscribe to the Portable Power Podcast for a new Game Boy review every day from Monday to Friday. Or alternately, new episodes of the podcast drop every Saturday and Sunday on whichever platform you get your pods. See you later on.